Do you remember this guy? His name is Michael Rotondo. He was a 30-year-old grown man with a ponytail who went through a court battle with his parents after they attempted to evict him from their house in upstate New York. And when Michael's story became national news, he was mercilessly dragged by cable news and angry uncles on Facebook for being proof to baby boomers that millennials are all entitled, lazy pieces of shit who can't stop leeching off their parents. And while his story is admittedly ripe with material for late-night hosts and Twitter pundits, Michael, like a lot of us, is literally just trying to find a place to live in a country where there isn't a single state where someone earning minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And if you give me a second, I can explain why so many of us are working our asses off just to be able to share the roof that we can barely afford to keep over our heads. In 2017, about 43 million Americans spent more than $485 billion on rent, which is the most money ever spent on rent in the history of, I don't know, history? In recorded history, ever since people started paying attention to how much you spend on rent? What did people used to spend on rent? Goats? Well, since then too. It's the most money. Half of the people in this country who do rent homes are spending more than 30% of their paychecks on rent at a time when apartment prices are skyrocketing and paychecks aren't. There are another 15 million Americans who spend more than half of their salaries on rent, and if you aren't one of those people, then you might be one of the 30% of renting Americans with at least one roommate. So you can thank your boss and your landlord for being the reasons you spend more time in your office than in your bedroom, but for some reason you still have no money. And our generation is living through this housing crisis in large part because our wages are stagnant. And when you account for inflation, our wages have the same purchasing power they did in the 1970s. Also, don't forget that we're drowning in $1 trillion of student debt, healthcare costs are up, and according to the Federal Reserve, we're earning less money, have less savings, and less assets than our parents did at our age, despite being the most educated, highly skilled generation in the history of America. All that's to say we're broke, dog. We can't afford a house, and that's why we are renting longer than any generation to be 20-something before us. However, there are actually politicians on Capitol Hill trying to do something about this, because even they can't afford to live near their job. I'm talking about universal rent control, something that will cap how much landlords can raise your rent every year, and it's already a law in Oregon. If you live in New York or LA or San Francisco, you've probably heard of rent-controlled apartments, and you know that finding one is like finding a unicorn. Because a rent-controlled apartment in New York means someone's great aunt or something has been living in the unit continuously since 1970, at least. And for the last nearly 50 years, they've been paying almost the same amount for a 3-bedroom on Park Avenue. When that person moves out, depending on the building, the unit returns to the current market value. And the laws in New York prevent any new apartments from becoming rent-controlled, eliminating rent-controlled apartments from the market altogether. So you can forget about one day taking over your random 89-year-old acquaintance's unit whom you've become friends with, in hopes that she leaves you her 3-bedroom on Park Avenue before time eliminates her ass from the earth. Which brings us back to Oregon, where the rents have been running amok over the last decade. And in certain parts of the state, people have seen their rents go up by as much as 113%. This all pushed legislators in the state to enact the country's first universal rent control law, which was passed last month. And the new law restricts landlords from increasing rent more than 7% plus the consumer price index, which measures the cost of living and inflation each year. It also means landlords can't evict you without cause, so they can't just sell your building and then tell you to get the fuck out. And this crazy idea that housing is a human right and not a luxury determined by the market in a developed nation is actually starting to catch on along the coasts. But naturally, anything that helps out actual people and takes money out of some rich asshole's pockets is going to face a lot of opposition. Critics of URC have said that policies like these will disincentivize landlords from renovating or staying on top of building upkeep. They've also said it disincentivizes further real estate development, which to me just sounds like people not wanting to gentrify your neighborhood. And if development is halted in the private sector, then it opens up lanes for cities to develop more affordable housing, since cities aren't motivated by profit. And in places like San Francisco, where there is a literal housing refugee crisis and people are living in vans and in tents and they're shitting on the street, landlords who are about as positive for that city as all that shit were converting buildings into condominium units so that they could sell them for prices that were just as egregious as the prices they were being rented for. So until we see rent control of some kind, rent prices around the country are going to continue to climb. And in New York City, there has been a 35% increase in vacant apartments. That means that in the past 4 years, nearly 200,000 units have become totally empty because no one can afford them. So most of us better get used to sharing a bathroom, whether that's with your friends from college, your significant other, or some random freak from Craigslist. Ted, shout out to you. Please stop masturbating so loudly. Because we're on track to see a lot more Michael Rotondos before the majority of us can actually afford to live in the cities where we work.